And this morning I want to talk about remarkable faith, not because the board did it, but because of what we see in Scripture. And or another title would be Faith That Makes Jesus Marvel. No one wants to be an example of weak faith. And yet, at some point or another, many of us find ourselves nursing an injured faith, maybe hoping for mercy and not knowing where it's coming from. I find it interesting that the only people that Jesus says anything about having little faith to is his disciples. It's not the people around him. It was the disciples, those men that he chose to walk beside him for 3.5 years to train and to be the ones that actually start the church in Acts. Those were the ones that Jesus often said, "Oh, you of little faith." And if Jesus found such little faith in his disciples, did he find any faith at all anyplace else? And yes, he did. And this morning, we want to look through just a couple of stories in the book of Matthew. Sprinkled throughout the Gospels are stories of nameless people who are examples of faith, remarkable faith. We're going to start with Matthew chapter 9. Matthew chapter 9, towards the end of the chapter, verse 27. As Jesus went on from there, 2 blind men followed him, calling out, "Have mercy on us, Son of David." And when he had gone indoors, the blind men came to him, and he asked them, "Do you believe that I am able to do this?" They had been asking him to heal them. "Yes, Lord," they replied. Then he touched their eyes and said, "According to your faith, it will be done to you." And their sight was restored. Jesus warned them sternly, "See that no one knows about this." But they went out and spread the news about him over all the region. They couldn't keep it quiet, much like Janice's story. She can't keep it quiet. Here are 2 blind men that have been following Jesus, calling out, asking for mercy, asking for him to heal them. And he had walked through Capernaum, and throughout this is about a day's ministry. This chapter 9 is about a day's ministry in Jesus' life. And what we want to do is, why would these blind men want to burst into a home that Jesus was trying to recline in? He was basically coming to his home after a day's ministry, time to put his feet up and rest, relax, and 2 blind men burst into the house. "Son of David, have mercy on us." Why would they do that? Well, we're going to go back in a day's life of Jesus and see possibly why. I don't know the answer. I don't know those blind men, okay? But possibly why they would do this. And so if we go back to the beginning of the chapter 9, verse 1. Jesus has stepped out of the boat. He has crossed over the sea. He had just finished healing the demonic man in the Gadarenes, and they kicked him out. So he comes back across to Capernaum. Jesus stepped out of the boat, crossed over, and came to his own town. Some men brought to him a paralytic lying on a mat. And when Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, "Take heart, son, your sins are forgiven." And of course, the scribes and Pharisees, they didn't like that. They accused him. Well, that's the story of, we teach it in Sunday school, the 4 guys that carry the fellow on the mat, and they rip open the roof and lower him down and, make a big mess of the home, and much like our old dining hall looks like now, that's that story. This is a very summarization of the story. But what I want you to see here is Jesus saw the faith of the 4 men. Not of the paralytic, although I'm sure he had faith as well. But I imagine he was probably more nervous than anybody. What do you mean you're going to lower me down in front of this crowd? You can just sort of see his mind racing and figuring out. But these 4 men had so much faith that they were going to do anything possible to get their friend to Jesus. They couldn't get in the door because it said the crowd was too big. Nobody cared about the paralytic, so they chose the other option. Go to the roof, rip it open, and lower our friend down in front of Jesus. And what's it say here? When Jesus saw their faith. And that causes me to ask the question, does Jesus see my faith? Is my faith so visible that people around me see it? That Jesus sees it? Or am I sort of that hidden Christian that I don't want to show my faith? I might get hurt or I might get laughed at. These people, these 4 did not matter. They didn't care that the religious leaders were down in front of Jesus. They didn't care that the crowd was an obstacle. They did everything possible to get their friend to Jesus. And Jesus responded by healing him. It's quite a story. How passionate is your faith? How passionate is my faith in bringing a helpless person to Jesus, or a hurting person, a needy person, someone that really needs Jesus? Do we have that kind of passion? I believe these 2 blind men were witnesses. Okay, were present. They couldn't see it. They're blind, right? But if you know anything about blind people, their sensitivity to hearing is so much better. They're listening for everything that's going on. And I believe these 2 blind men at the end of the chapter were somewhere in that crowd. And they heard that transaction. Let's go on. Let's jump down to verse 19. Jesus calls Matthew and so on. And here in verse, we'll start at verse 18. While he was saying this, while he was talking with the Pharisees and those that were questioning him about fasting, while he was saying this, a ruler came and knelt before him, and he said, "My daughter has just died, but come and put your hand on her, and she will live." Jesus got up and went with him, and so did his disciples. Other Gospels name this person. It's Jairus. Jairus and his daughter. His daughter was dead, but Jairus really believed that Jesus could heal and bring her back to life. That's not the story I want you to see. I want you to see what happens. Here he is. Jesus is going with Jairus. He's on his way to his home. Verse 20, just then, a woman who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years came up from behind him and touched the edge of his cloak. And she said to herself, "If I would only touch his cloak, I will be healed." Jesus turned and saw her. "Take heart, daughter," he said, "your faith has healed you." And the woman was healed from that moment. He goes on into Jairus' home, and of course he raises the daughter back to life. But here's a woman, 12 years, with an ailment that literally shut down her social life. In Jewish culture, any woman in her cycle was not allowed to touch or be around anybody. And that usually, lasts a few days, and that's it. But this woman, for 12 years, had an issue. She spent everything, other gospel says, she spent everything she could on doctors and could not get healed. That meant she couldn't go to worship because she couldn't be in the synagogue. That meant that she couldn't go shopping when everybody else did, because if she touched somebody, they were unclean. And in Jewish culture, cleanliness was pushed really, really hard. Her family, she couldn't pick up her child. They would be unclean. We read in Matthew really is a very quick synopsis of the story. But when you really consider where this woman was at, she was at the end of her rope. There was nothing that she could do without being an outcast. Everybody knew who she was. Everybody knew that if she was walking the streets, we had to walk the other side. Can you imagine what that would do to you? And yet here she is, if I would only touch his cloak. Now, to touch his cloak, as I say, the other Gospels say that as he was walking down the street, the crowd was really, really big. I liken it to Black Friday in the Mall of America, and you want to get over there, and, you have to go, 15 miles around to get there because the crowd is so big. That, just sort of get your picture. And here, this woman who has an issue, if she touches anybody who's going to be unclean, she wants to touch Jesus' cloak. What did she have to do? She had to somewhat camouflage herself. She had to work her way through the crowd and touch the hem of his garment. Now that took faith. That took courage. Because if anybody saw her and recognized her, they would be unclean. And so what does she do? She does it. Other gospel says that she touched and then she tried to hide in the crowd and tried to just touch and go. But Jesus here, it's a summation, Jesus recognized. In fact, he said to the disciples once, "Who touched me?" The disciples said, "What do you mean? The crowd's so big, everybody's touching you." No. Somebody's touched me with faith. And it was her. And Jesus looked around to see who it was. Did Jesus know who it was? Oh, I knew it. I know he knew. But he looks around, he sees who it, finds out to see who it was. And I really believe that their eyes met. And the eyes of Jesus was compassion and was, "I love you." And she came and she told the whole story. And I'm sure she came, much like Janice, totally open. But I can well imagine what the crowd was thinking. Oh, it's her. She touched me. I remember, I'm unclean. Jesus didn't even respond to any of that. He just looks at her and says, "Your faith has healed you." And instantly, she was healed. After 12 years of not being able to worship, touch her kids, get a hug from her husband, go shopping, she can now do it all. Why? Because of faith. And I believe those two blind men heard that story too. It's all in the same day. This woman, she was desperate. She had desperate faith. And she reached out in desperation to the person that could meet her. The final story is actually happened a day earlier. And have to go back to Matthew chapter 8. This is, I love the story of the woman, but this one grabs my attention. And this one grabbed the attention of Jesus too, because watch what happens. Chapter 8, verse 5. When Jesus had entered Capernaum, this is the first time or one of the times he's coming to Capernaum before he goes over across to the Gadarenes. So he enters Capernaum. A centurion came to him asking for help. "Lord," he said, "my servant lies at home paralyzed and in terrible suffering." Jesus said to him, "I will go and heal him." The centurion replied, "Lord, I do not deserve to have you come under my roof, but just say the word and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes, and that one, come, and he comes. I say to my servant, do this, and he does it." And when Jesus heard this, look what it says. He was astonished and said to those following him, "I tell you the truth. I have not found anyone in Israel with such a great faith." This is a Roman centurion. No faith. Basically was there to keep order and to instill the Roman rule on Jewish. And this Roman centurion comes to Jesus with a problem. The problem was a servant. He must have had a real heart of compassion because generally servants are a dime a dozen. But I really believe that this servant was similar to what Joseph was in Potiphar's life. Okay, he was probably a head servant, a very reliable, very loyal, and maybe even head servant over everybody else. I don't know, but that's some of the reading I've done. That's what they sort of indicate, and that may be true, and that's why maybe he had such a big concern for him. Nonetheless, it's a Roman centurion that actually had compassion on somebody, and this person was not doing well, and he comes to Jesus, or he asks Jesus to come and heal him. And then he says, "But hold it, you're not even worthy to come into my home." Here's a Roman centurion that recognized an authority that the religious leaders didn't even recognize of Jesus. This Roman centurion, he recognizes that Jesus has authority. And he recognizes it because he had authority and he had the opportunity to, he was under authority and he also had authority. And Jesus hears that and is astonished. You mean, my paraphrase, you mean that you believe that I only have to speak the word and your servant will be healed? I don't have to go and touch him? That's really what's happening here. Just speak, and my servant will be healed. And Jesus is astonished. And to me, that's amazing. Here's a Roman centurion, has nothing to do with religion so much, although other gospel says that he had paid to build a synagogue, but I think that was probably more of a peacekeeping thing than anything, to prove that, I'm here for you, but don't step out of line. And here he comes to Jesus. And he says, just speak. And Jesus goes, wow. I haven't seen faith like this in anyone in Israel. What a statement. If Jesus were here, and he is here, by the way, in this room right now, what would he say about us? Would he say our faith is such that, wow, I haven't seen such great a faith in all of Crystal City, Manitoba, Canada, you name the place. Really puts a question on us, doesn't it? And you see, that's Capernaum. These two blind men probably heard that too. Jesus goes over, heals the Gadarene, comes back, walks through, and that woman, Jairus' daughter, the paralytic, and now we're at the end of the chapter again. Why did these two blind men burst into the home? Because they had heard about all this faith, and they knew beyond a shadow of a doubt, I really believe beyond a shadow of a doubt, that this man, we can't see him, we don't know what he looks like, but this man can heal us. And we're going to do similar to the four guys. We're just going to interrupt his sleep, or his rest, because we want Jesus to touch us and to heal us. So when we get to the end of chapter 9, and we see where Jesus says, according to your faith, it will be done. And their sight was restored. Remarkable faith in a few stories in the life, a day of Jesus, a day and a half, maybe 2 days of Jesus' ministry. Individuals outside of Jairus we know nothing about. We don't know their names. We don't know their status in society. Don't know the color of their skin. All we know is that Jesus saw their faith. He heard their faith. He witnessed desperate faith. And he responded. I had Hebrews 11 read as a scripture reading. And maybe you can see where I'm going with this, with that. Because here in verse 1 it says this, now faith is being sure of what we hope for, and certain of what we do not see. Faith is being sure of what we hope for. The Roman centurion hoped and believed that Jesus could heal his servant. The four guys that carried the paralytic, their hope was in Jesus, that he was going to heal their friend. The woman who made her way through the crowd, her hope was in just touching would heal her. And these blind men who ran into Jesus through a closed door, ran to Jesus through a closed door, their hope was in him. Now, faith is being sure of what we hope for. We hope Jesus will heal us. We hope Jesus will do for us what we are asking. But it's the second part of it, and certain of what we do not see. The blind people, the blind guys. They didn't see Jesus. They couldn't see him. And then go down to verse 6. There's an explanation, examples of faith, but verse 6. Now faith, and without faith it is impossible to please God. Because anyone, that includes you, that includes me, anyone who comes to him, that's the woman with the issue, that's the paralytic, that's the blind man, that's the Roman centurion. Because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists. Every single one of them that Jesus contacted that day and ever since has to believe he exists. Because why would you come to somebody that doesn't exist? They believe that he exists and that he's a rewarder, or he rewards those who earnestly seek him. And all four stories show that he rewards the earnest seeker. So faith, even though it may be as small as a mustard seed, as Jesus said, it needs to be a believing faith. It needs to be a visible faith. It needs to be a desperate faith. And when we humble ourselves before God with a faith like this, that pleases God. Not only pleases God, Jesus marvels at it. So the question I have for myself, and every time I look at this, I ask myself, where's my faith at today? At what level? Do I really believe God? Is it lip service, or is it really heart service? And that's my challenge for you this morning. Where's your faith? How strong is your faith? Is it desperate? Do people see it? Is it visible? Is it declaring? Can you speak it? Can you share it? Because that's what Jesus wants of us.